If you all have Tanachim, do you? Maybe just hand out Tanachim. So I'm going to ask you, because portion we're going to talk about, I don't think, assuming everyone's up to date, so you haven't read this portion, but it's a small chapter. So just read, open to perek Kaf Daled, Pasuk Tet Vav, Pasuk Tet Vav, till the end of the perek. Really even till Kaf Daled, but you can read another 2-3 pasukim. So it's really 12 pasukim. So take it. I mean, we can read it together, but I think it's good. Kaf Daled Tet Vav, till the end. You're good? You wanna... Actually, I have a very good idea. Bajo, why don't you read it?
I don't want to ruin the surprise.
No, just read it and just, translate the words. You don't have to give the whole Hadushim, I'm sure. Yeah,
I'm going to stop going to the class and keep picking on me.
What did I do? In fact, Joey, can you just...
Don't turn the camera.
There I was picking on you. Okay, but come on.
فدبر العام ببوكر بتعمل تشبي بعاري بعاص ببوكر كاشف سجراتي فيوملوا إليه عام هروت جدلانو ما إلي لانو كي تعصي وأمر لهم دبر العام هيا إلى دمار أمر لبيت إسرائيل فأمر العام لهم إنني محللت مختشي جون قزخم محمل نخم ومحمل نخم ونخم ونخم أشبزتهم بحرب كول وعصيتهم كاشر عصيتي عصتان نوت عطو بلخم نشم نوت خم وكل خم هو رشخم على خم رجلخم نوت سبدي بلوت كو ومقوتهم وعبنوتهم ونمتهم إيش الأخير فهي يحسكي لخم المفيد كخوا أشير عصات عصوم وقاهم بيزعتهم كأني نوعي نبي فأتر من الجام هذا بيوم كحتي مهمة مع أوزام لصوص فرتهم مثل أحمد مهمة مع سنة شام بنهم نوتهم فيوم هو يبار فريق الأخر هشمون تزنان فيوم هو يبقى تحتيها التفريق واستبال وضع المعود فهيت لأن المفيد يدوك كأني نوعي.
So, when you read this perek, a few questions obviously are going to stand out. So what are some of them? What are some of the questions you have when you read this perek? Right, well, yeah, okay, so let's go. Yeah, let's start from the beginning. Why kill this innocent woman? What does God have to this? Right, that's okay. So we have a theological question. Why? Oh, okay, and that's another question. Good. Why shouldn't he mourn? Good. Why shouldn't he mourn? And what else? Well, depending on how you'll answer the first question, that'll create another question. You're going to answer that question with going to be what? Why doesn't he mourn? What does it say? Simple text of the psukim. Why doesn't he mourn? And so they ask a question, and what's going to be the answer? I mean, you're not going to mourn. Well, the question, well, why shouldn't they mourn? Why not? So, right, so we have this, simple questions, really. What's going on here? So, another time, maybe, we'll talk about a topic which I think is very apropos for Yehezkel, which is in general Yehezkel topic, which is really called simliyut, what I call simliyut b'Yehezkel. Yehezkel, as you've already seen, is unique amongst the Nevi'im in the level of his, what we'll call ma'asim simliyim. It's something that's unique theme in Yehezkel, more than any other Nevi. Now, it's true, other Nevi'im do ma'asim simliyim, but Yehezkel has it strong. And as with other Nevi'im, certainly in Yehezkel, you have a debate on how to understand the Ma'asim Simliyim, right? You'll have the very famous statement of Harambam that many of this is done b'nevu'ah. So the Rambam, just as you have, for example, explicit things that Yehezkel sees b'nevuah, i.e. his movement from Babel to Eretz Israel through his hair and things like that, and clearly sometimes he says it b'nevuah. Also, these actions, these bizarre actions, are b'nevuah. Against that, and that's not necessarily relevant to here for a minute, against that you'll have an opinion like the Abarbanel, who argues strongly on that Rambam. And he says, no. Nevi'im were not meant to be popular people. And you know what? They weren't even meant to be aneshim mechubadim. They were meant to do things, and their lives was dedicated to bringing the people back b'tshuva. So if they had to act strangely, Kolo that doesn't explicitly say, well, they did it. And we've seen a lot of the strange actions of Yirmiyah, certainly of Yeshaya, right? And Hosea, all those, you know. However, it doesn't seem that you can take this chapter as a nevuah. It's very hard, according to either opinion, really, to look at this chapter as a nevuah. Well, why? Right. Pasuk Yud Het really makes that almost impossible, because he has to relate this to the people, and the people are supposed to tell. In other words, I would say Pasuk 18 certainly, but even Pasuk Yutet even more, right? Vayomru elai ha'am halo tagid lanu ma ele lanu ki ata oseh. What are you doing? In other words, obviously the people saw action, so it doesn't seem that anyone, Rambam included, would call this a nevuah. Now, I'm saying that because we just lost an important answer to one of our questions, right? If we could do nevuah, we'd answer a chapter that poses a lot of theological and moral problems, right? So I think that avenue for this chapter, regardless of how you read the other chapters, I think is closed, right? I don't think that anyone can say that you're dealing here with a nebuah. I think this really happened. And part of, actually I have a Tanach. I'm sorry, but you can. So part of Nevi'im is really their family, the Nevi's family lives is impacted, right? We've seen that. We can give a list of Nevi'im that, and could anyone think of Nevi'im that their family lives are disrupted? Hosea, that's the obvious one, right? Hosea has to marry this Zonah, and the question is, that's the one, okay, marry, if you take it a little, has to marry this Zonah, get rid of her, this, tell the children, okay. Anyone else? Maybe not as drastic. Where? Right, he has to have the kids, he has to name the kids. Probably minus Yehezkel, the most drastic. Okay, leaving the family is not something that, because then you can start with Moshe Rabbeinu. Leaving the family, I got it. To leave the family for the Nebuah, because we're talking where the family itself is impacted, or lack of family. Yirmiyah can't have a family. He can't have wife. He can't have children. That's pretty radical, right? Right? So, yeah, just read that, Yirmiyah, Tet Zayin. Thank you. I appreciate that. ויהי דבר אדוני לאמור לא תיקח לך אישה ולא יהיו לך בנים ובנות במקום הזה. כי כה אמר אדוני לבנים ולבנות היהודים במקום הזה ומותם ילדות אותם על אבותם ולדים אותם בארץ הזאת ומותי תחלואים ימותו. לא יספדו ולא יקברו. So we'll get back to that because that's going to be probably the closest parallel chapter to here. The difference is Yehezkel's got a wife that he's got to lose. Yirmiyah doesn't get a family. And in both cases, there's the situation of no burials. So we have other incidents where the Nevi'im families are impacted. Now, that I mentioned to you that I don't think this could become a Nebu'ah, this is mentioned explicitly in the Perush of Rabbi Menachem ben Shimon, and he writes, Umiksat anashim pershu, shelo haya emet, rak haya mar'eh, ולא שמו ליבם אל הפסוק הבא כן, ואדבר אל העם בבוקר, וגם לפסוק האחר, הלא תגיד לנו מה אלה לנו. ואם יטעון טוען, אם כן השם המית את אשתו להיות אות על ישראל? That's his question. So that's really a question we have to ask now, right? Why would Hashem kill her? For it to be an ot al Yisrael. So he answers, and he says, Neshiveu ki Hashem lo kitzer yameha, rak ba yom ala'u lamut umeta b'magefa le'ot al-Yisrael shinagefu gam hem. וגם האות שלא יתאבלו על בניהם ובנותם מרוב צרתם, כאשר לא יתאבל הנביא על אשתו. Basically, she was dying anyway. And Hashem sort of took advantage of that fact to get us somewhere, to teach us something. That's the Perush he just said. In other words, she was going to die anyway. This was her time to die. Right? Now you could read this that she was going to die anyway in the Magefa, or she was going to die anyway, and God made her die this way. Actually, God used the fact that she was dying, and she was going to die, to give a message to the people. But Has v'Shalom, says Rabbi Menachem Shimon, that God did not shorten her life at all. A similar position is taken by Abarbanel. V'nei usach lomar b'magefa. Why did it say b'magefa? Die in magefa. Lahagid שלא תהיה מיתתה כדי לעשות הרמז הזה מעניינה. כי היא בסיבת המגפה תמות, והמגפה היא בעוון העיר. There was a מגפה, and she died in a מגפה. Irrespective. Right? So God didn't kill Eshet Yehezkel, but uses her death for a tzorech. Okay. So what do you think about that? You read the chapter. What? What's the problem? What's the problem with such a perush? Hineni lokeh, meaning what? Meaning, how should it have been written if this was true? What? No, I would say, Vatamot Eshet Yehezkel. Vayomer Hashem Yehezkel. Hanek Dom Papa. Right? By the way, his wife died. Rather, Hineni Lokeh, it's very difficult. It's very difficult. How do you deal with those psukim? And so this Perush of Abarbanel and Rabbi Menachem Shimon is except kasher with the pshat of the psukim. So, what do we do with their theological problem? We ignore it. We basically are not bothered by it. That's it. The Navi has his own rules. He lives by his own rules. Nevi'im have rough lives. And God makes examples out of them in harsh ways. It's true this is probably the harshest example in all of Nevi'im, but that's it. In other words, when you look at the pshat of the psukim and you rule out that it's a vision, as Rabbi Menachem ben Shimon did. Now he had the theological problem, so he created a perush that's quite difficult within the pshat. right? But if we're going to follow the pshat and say, and say as he did that it wasn't a vision, all we can do is say, that is what happens to Nebi'im. This is part of the subjugation of the Nebi. Clearly, Yehezkel is probably the most subjugated to his Nebu'ah out of all the Nebi'im. Although, Yehezkel also complains, right? Yehezkel also is not, he utters the complaints as, it's not only Yirmiyah that complains, Yehezkel complains. And he says here, yeah, where is that? Yud Het, right? It's Yud Het, no? Well, I thought it was Yud Het. It's not Yud Het. Oh, no, early on. Where he seems forced. Go back early on in Gimel 14. So that shows that Yehezkel does complain, but we see clearly that we're dealing with a situation where Yehezkel's subjugation forces the situation. Okay, let's read some of the psukim. Before I move on, we have a difficult pasuk that really needs to be interpreted before we move on. In other words, in order we can understand this properly. In other words, before we continue with the theme, I want to deal with, for a few minutes, some of the words in this pasuk because it's pretty hard to interpret. So, Hashem says, Ben Adam, Hineni lokach mimchad mahmad enecha. Well, mahmad enecha is not defined here. It'll only be defined after it happens in pasuk Yud Het. What is this mahmad enecha? We don't know. Could be his kids, could be his wife, could be something unique, special that he's taking from him. We don't know. It'll later become clear. V'tam utishti. V'magefa v'lo tispod v'lo tivke v'lo tivod imatecha. Lo tispod, lo tivke, v'lo tavod imatecha. Now, the next 6 words are a little tricky to understand. We're going to have to spend some time here. He'anek dom. Metim evel lo ta'aseh. Right? So, even the ta'amim are still a little hard to figure out how to break it. So, because even the ta'amim here are not going to help us solve the problem. So, before I go into maybe the harder part, the metim evel, we need to look at the first 2 words first. What does he'anek dom mean? Right? What is he'anek dom? So, dom, most for lashon dimama. So, we have to figure out what this means. So, there's itself a few ways to read it. Perush Rabbi Yehuda ibn Bal'am, published by Bari Ilan, if you ever see it. Explains like this. He'anek dom means cry quietly. He'anek, you can cry inner. You can cry, I'm giving you a kula. I'm giving you a leniency. He'anek dom. Cry quietly, but, and now he'll read the rest. Metim avel lo ta'aseh. Metim avel means avel ala metim lo ta'aseh. Meaning cry inside, but do not do any public avelut. The Radak explains a little differently. He'anek dom says, me'anek dom. Meaning, he uses the he'anek not as a command, but almost as the makor. Mehanek dom. From crying, silence yourself. Mehanek dom. From crying out, be quiet. Dom be'atzmecha. Shelo tiz'ok bechi be'atzmecha aleh. You are all avelut. Even personal avelut. Even personal crying is all forbidden. That's the Radak. However, the word dom may have a different usage. If we take a look at Echa, who wants to read this one? Echa. I have two sources for you to read now, and I want to read it in this order because I want to hear what you have to say as to if I read it the other way, you might have a different way of looking at it. So, Echa, perek bet, pasuk yod. Who wants to read it? Any takers? Go ahead. So, what is Yidimu there? Yeshivu la'aretz. Yidimu ziknei bat Zion. It is not to be avel. He'elu afal rosham. Hageru sakim. Horidu la'aretz rosham. Israel. And it doesn't even say, can't even say it means don't cry. Why? Next pasuk. Read the next one. So this Yidimu means what? Some form of bereavement, right? Possibly. Now, go back to Yeshaya Kef Gimel Bet. Any takers for that one? Yeshaya Kef Gimel Bet. Anybody? Go ahead. So it's usually translated over there, Domu, as be quiet. Right? Domu yoshvei, right? Soher Sidon over Yameluch. Meaning, don't cry for them. Or, the E is quieted because there's no more Soharim. However, based on the way we read it in Echa, it could also be a sign of showing signs of bereavement. By the way, if that's the case, Vayidom Aharon may take a new idea. Right, but it says Kalu b'dima'ot einai, the next pasuk.
Well, they're crying, but
right.
Not that they're not crying, just that they're silent from. They're stunned and silent. It was such a calamity that they're just
stunned.
They're speechless.
Right. It could such a thing. Right. In other words, it's more of a over there. It doesn't seem. We'll take a look again, maybe. Not denying that. If we take a look, it seems to say. Yeshivu la'aretz yidemu ziknei bat Zion. Right? In other words, they're sitting on the ground. You're saying they're quiet out of speech. Not they're just speechlessness, right? Said it. One last one on this Hanek Dom. That has a similar outcome to Radak. unlike Rabbi Yehuda ben Bal'am, who says, Ha'anek, Rabbi Eliezer Belgency, Ha'anek b'libecha, dom, meaning, Ha'anek b'libecha, dom, even, in other words, you want to cry, it has to only be inside. Ha'anek b'libecha, dom, hitapek. Meaning, hold back, all the crying has to be inside, it can't come out. So again, so you have really two schools of what he was allowed to do. Was he allowed to cry privately, or even that was forbidden? According to Ibn Bal'am, he can cry privately. He'anik dom, meaning he'anik bidmama, cry out privately. According to Radak, me'he'anik dom, right? He'anik is not the command, only dom is the command, right? And others, he'anik b'libecha, only in your lip. Okay, so that he'anik dom. Then we continue, and we say, the pasuk continues and says, he'anik dom, right? And the pasuk gets even harder, because it says, he'anik dom, mitim evel lo ta'aseh. So, many mefarshim will say, what does it mean, mitim evel lo ta'aseh? So, the Radak says, like hafuch. Kemo, says Radak, kemo hafuch. Avel metim lo ta'aseh. Switch it. Avel metim, not metim avel, meaning avel ala metim. However, there could be another actual way to read it, which doesn't totally, which is a suggestion of some mefarshim, which doesn't totally destroy the ta'amim. It says, he'anek dom mitim, evel lo ta'aseh. מה זה? he'anek dom mitim, evel lo ta'aseh. So, a few ways to look at that, even that reading. He'anek dom mitim, meaning, what?
Cry out in the same way that dead people are silent. So don't
Right, a
cry out.
deathly silence. Right. He'anek dom mitim, like dimama shel mavet, like. Right? Avel lo ta'aseh. That fits a lot with also, even though that's not how the Radak reads it, it fits like with the Radak without changing the order of the thing, because it says he'anek dom mitim, avel lo ta'aseh, meaning like a mitim, be as silent as the dead. אתה לא יכול להגיד כלום. If, however, we can say that he'anek dom means that you were he'anek quietly, like a groan, so we could say he'anek dom metim could also mean groan a mourning for the dead. He'anek bidmama ala metim. Meaning, אבל אבל לא תעשה. זה גם יכול להיות. And by the way, it really doesn't, as I said, it really doesn't ruin the ta'amim. Because the ta'amim could go either way. Later commentaries bring out an interesting point, and they say that he'anek dom is actually could be the two opposing forces, where you're showing in the complexity of Yehezkel's situation. He'anek dom, meaning he'anek is to call out. Dom is to be quiet. So, he'anek dom means you want to call out and you want to quiet. In other words, this deep contradiction within Yehezkel. It's his wife. He needs to cry out. But dom because of the nebuah. So, in other words, it's he'anek dom. Okay. The question now is, which we says, okay, so I just wanted to clarify that pasuk because I think that pasuk is difficult and has multiple amounts of perushim. Why should not Yehezkel sit avelut? Why not? Right? So it's interesting. This wife, all she does, right? But tamot ishti b'ayin, right? We don't. She's an absolute object of the nevuah, right? Nothing. But tamut ishti, all she does is just die. That's all. That's it. She's just dead. Yehezkel now's reaction here is translated, interesting, in an active component. Meaning, although a lot of his actions are inactions, it's said about him, Va'as baboker ka'asher suveti. I did as I was commanded. Va'as baboker ka'asher suveti. Now, that doing has in itself action and inaction, at least according to the way Hazal read the psukim. For example, He'anek dom, we're told, Hazal says what? Don't study Torah. Over there, he's following Avelut, and we learn Avelut from Yehezkel. Right? And then, Avelut tase. Perha havosh alecha. What is that? Put on your tefillin. Meaning, Avel, we learn here, is patur from tefillin. Again, we learn a lot of Ilchot Avelut from here. And in this case, he's to do something that Avel is not to do. Un'alecha tasim beroglecha. Again, he's to do something that an Avel is not to do. Keep your shoes on. Here he's not to do something that an Avel is to do, meaning to eat the bread of other people. So we have action and inaction, and we're learning here a lot of the laws of Avelut. Parenthetically, how do we know? Sometimes we learn the laws of Avelut from what Yehezkel did, and we're to imitate him, like Ha'anekdom. And sometimes we're to learn from Yehezkel the laws, basically what he's supposed to do, meaning not perform like Avelut, but we learn what we're supposed to abstain or do, meaning we are to do the opposite of what Yehezkel does. How do we know when is what? How do Hazal know what to do? What's the method that Hazal used, right? It's difficult. So is there any method? So Tosfot in Sukkot Daf Kafei Amud Aleph gives us a method. Tosfot says that when the Navi is commanded to do things that we would normally do, so obviously the point of the Navi to command us, the point for the Navi to be commanded to do it is the point of that is to do what? Is to tell us that, in other words, if the Navi is telling us, for example, put on tefillin. If the Navi is told put on tefillin, well, we have to tell someone to put on tefillin. Everyone puts on tefillin. No, it means that we should not put on tefillin. In other words, if the Navi is commanded to continue status quo behavior, so then we should assume everyone else, says Tosfot, doesn't do that. If the Navi is commanded to stop doing something, right? Or really for example, He'anek dom, stop learning, so then we all stop learning like Yehezkel. In other words, the idea, if the Navi, that's Tosfot's logic. If the Navi is commanded to do something that we are always doing, then we do the opposite of Yehezkel. If the Navi is commanded to continue doing what he is, right? If the Navi is commanded to change what he would do, then we follow his change, right? Because then he's doing something different. So, but if he's doing the same, other Rishonim have different methods. That's the method of Tosfot. I don't want to get too into it, but just as a side point. Again, so back to our question of why should Yehezkel not sit Avel. So first thing I want to say is we have to understand the fact that Yehezkel is not sitting Avel is directly resulting from the command of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He's Anus. That's clear. I do so because some almost silly Perushim, which try and look into Yehezkel. Literally, I read, usually modern scholars say, Yehezkel had psychological issues, because they quote other psukim where he was not fond of women, so he had his wife, but he didn't want to sit, so he wanted to not sit so he was felt bad because he did love his wife, she's Mahmad Einecha, but he had this psychological torment of whether he should or should not sit. That's ridiculous, and others say he didn't sit because he was personally shocked. He was sort of baffled, like he couldn't. That may happen to the people later in the Nimshal, but certainly not the situation with Yehezkel. The pasuk is very clear that it is because of the command of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's not a personal thing that Yehezkel chose. It's very clear in the psukim, certainly within the pshat of the psukim. So we should not pay any attention to such perushim. Now the question is, why not? Some say that Yehezkel was commanded based on, they point to Yehezkel Mem Dalid, and they say Yehezkel really shouldn't sit Avil because he was Kohen. And the Kehuna, although Kohanim can be Avilim, but clearly if you go to Yehezkel Mem Dalid, you'll see extra Humrot on the average Kohen, which follow the laws even of Kohen Gadol. So since that would be the situation with Yehezkel, so therefore, that's the case with Yehezkel, so therefore he's accepting upon himself extra chumrah. Now that, again, seems to violate the pshat of the psukim, because it's clearly that this is to be a message for the people. And if it was extra chumrah of kehuna, that would absolutely be irrelevant to the people. So, rather, simplest way to look at it is the way Radak looks at it. Radak says, right, that the reason you're not to sit Avel is that this is again a Maaseh Simli, you need to have a semel, a action that will indicate for the people that they're not supposed to sit, right? By you not sitting, you will be mofet l'Yisrael, ki ken ya'asu merov hatzarot. Why won't they sit? Why not? So there are two schools of thought amongst the Rishonim as to why they won't sit. And one, Rashi brings two. I'm going to read Rashi because it's not so pashut, even that they're both in Rashi. But I'm going to read Rashi, and maybe you'll argue with how we're going to read it, but we'll see. So, v'asitem kasher isiti, lo tinahagu avelut. You won't be noheg avelut, or you should not be noheg avelut. To the people now, not to Yehezkel. You will not be noheg avelut, or you should not be noheg avelut. So let's continue. Ki ein menahamim lachem. You will have no comforters. She'en bahem echad shelo ya'avel. They'll all be avelim. Ve'en avelut ela bimkom menahamim. And there's no avelut. What does that mean? There's no din of avelut ela bimkom menahamim. Or since you can't be covered, there's no point to be avel. So, okay. Then he brings a second perush, Rashi. She brings a second perush, and he says, Davar aher, shetiyu yireim livkot lifnei askitim v'Hashem betocham. You're going to be too afraid. You're going to be amongst the bavlim. You're going to be too scared to do any of this. The first one can be understood, almost as a command. The people are commanded not to be noheg avilut. Just as Yehezkel was commanded not to be noheg avel, so too the people are commanded not to be noheg avilut. Right? The other one, or you could read it as you won't have minahamim. You will not have minahamim, and as you won't have minahamim, there'll be no point for you to be abil, and this is just a prophetic thing that's going to happen to you, symbolic of a disaster or terrible problems that you're going to have. In fact, the Rabbi Yeshaya Mitrani, he says, says here. Wait a second. I'm sorry. Rabbi Yosef Kara. He says, when he says, don't do this, כלומר, שאם יהיו שניים ושלושה גולים, השאר יהיו מצטערים עליהם. אבל עכשיו שגולים כולם, מי יתאבל עליהם? Right? He's just saying, he brings this lack of avelim as the point that there's not going to be any point. Rabbi Yeshaya Mitrani says, when he says, לא תספדו ולא תבכו, שלא יהיו רשעים בבבל לבכות החורבן ירושלים מפני הכסדים. Like the second perush of Rashi. The point here is, the idea of not being mitabel for the people can be looked at on as a command of, I am Yehezkel, you don't do it. Why? So they will learn that they're not allowed to do it. Why won't they be allowed to do it? Well, because it's not shayuch for avelut. It could be also that they won't be allowed to do it because them not being allowed to be mitabel, or they're commanded not to be mitabel, is some form of tziduk hadin upon themselves. Or do we say that their lack of avelut is like a fact that's going to happen? It's going to be the puranut that will have. Your lack of avelut is the puranut. It seems to be that just knowing the idea of a Samuel in Yehezkel, that it would seem to be the latter. That every time you have a Samuel, it means the Samuel is not something. When you are to receive that Ma'aseh Simli, the people just to receive a message. It doesn't ask them to do anything with it. In all the cases that we have in Yehezkel. So this shouldn't be any different. And it seems to be some form of a prediction, as specifically we read in Yehezkel, Kaf Daled, V'haya Yehezkel lachem lemofet. It'll be a mofet. Kechol asher asa ta'asu. Not ta'asu as a command, but you will do. Ta'asu b'avidatem k'ani Hashem. And then you will know that I am God. Meaning, this way you're going to know it. Now, just to support this, if you open up Yehezkel, different chapter in Yehezkel, Yehezkel Yud Bet. Right? And he's commanded to do this whole thing with the kelim. And then he says, if you look, we're told, Ki mofet netaticha lebet Yisrael. Right? This idea of the klei gola, and what does that mean, that mofet? Pasuk zayin, va'as ken kasher suveti, right, he did it. Kelai hotzeti klei gola yomam va'erev hatarti bo bakir. And then in Pasuk Het. Right? Yeah, no, Pasuk Yudalef, this is the one I wanted. Emor ani moftetchem, ka'asher asiti, ken ya'aseh lahem bagola b'shivi yelechu. In other words, the mofet is an idea of what will happen to them, not what they should do. So, and if you look at that chapter, it's very clear that most of the muftim are like that, right? And so, and the mufet is even further here, that it's not just that the mufet is a sign that this is going to happen, but when it does happen, you're going to know that it was from me, that it didn't just happen, right? When it happens the way I say it's going to happen, you're going to know that this whole thing was from me. So in other words, it's obviously not a command. Don't, because it has to be a sign that you're going to know that this came from me. So it must be, and it seems to be, that it's going to be some form of prediction. And when this sign that I'm going to do this, which will predict what will happen to you, you won't sit Avel. Not because I don't allow you to be sitting Avel, because you won't. And that is a prediction. And when that prediction comes true, it's going to add that you're going to know that I am Hashem brought this upon you. Okay, now we'll have a question. Well, why won't they be mitabel? Right? Why not?
But, no, I'm not answering that question, but we say al nachalat babel gam bachinu.
Sham yashamnu gam bachinu bezochrenu et Zion. Right? So, afuch, that's Hazal read that as a proof that that's the first time they were able to sit down and cry. Hazal bring over there that Nebuchadnezzar never let them sit and cry until they actually got into Galut. Al Naharot Bavel. So in Eretz Israel there was no crying, only in Bavel. So therefore that's.
Wasn't that on the way to Babel?
Well, it's certainly on the but it's certainly in Bavel. Al Naharot Bavel. By the time we've crossed into Bavel, right? It could be on the way to where they were going, but it's once they were in Bavel, where it would be too late, says the Midrash, for them to arouse the Rahmanut of Hashem. But if they would cry prior, Hashem, says Nebuchadnezzar, would be Menachem Aleihim. So that's the Midrash. So that might fit well with this idea that they won't have. So why won't they be Mitabel? So either one, because they'll realize that they deserve it, or probably, more appropriately, and this helps us understand a little bit, what the importance of Avelut. The importance of Avelut is as we know, is a very comforting thing on an individual level and a very societal level. On an individual level, by being mit'abel, it lets you connect with the Meroham on multiple levels and lets you ease on a new level. You have a new relationship, and a relationship of memory. You move the relationship of interaction, of Riyah, and you learn, and that person has to enter into a new realm in your memory. So that's part of what Avelut helps happen. The lack of Avelut is not only a lack of closure, but it's an idea of total helplessness. And specifically, the idea of no minahamim. I mean, there's no point to be mitavel, because it's not going to do anything. Meaning so you don't have that. I mean, I'm going to remove that. And like you said, that shock, that quickness, that it's so fast and it's so devastating. One can imagine, for example, right? One could imagine that a person who lost his relative in Auschwitz didn't even have time to cry, or didn't even have tears left in him to cry. It was so numb. There's a numbness that's going to enter in at the devastation. Likewise for society as well. The loss of Avel and the loss of the ritual of Avel really indicates the loss of the definition of the society that you're in. And here we'll refer back to the chapter that we started with in Yirmiyah, where Yirmiyah is told, don't take a wife. Why? Now, it's not relevant to him, but we have a similar idea, because Yamutu lo yisafdu v'lo yikaveru l'domei al pnei adama yu u'bacherev u'barav yichlu v'aytani v'latam le'ma'achal of Hashem be'emet ha'aretz. Right? There's not going to be any ki asafti et shilomi me'et ha'am hazeh ne'um Hashem et ha'chesed ve'et ha'rachamim ומתו גדולים וקטנים בארץ הזאת לא יקבר ולא יספדו להם ולא יתגודד ולא יקרח בהם ולא יפוס להם על אבל לנחמו על מת ולא ישקו אותם כוס נחמו מאבי ואמו ובית משתה לא תבוא לשבת אותם לאכול ולשתות. Why? כי הנני, and because in other words, the idea of lack of avelut is similar to a lack of simha, meaning the entire societal structure of all your ritual is gone. You'll be devoid of any defining identity. It's all lacking. And I think based on this chapter in Yirmiyah, it's much more elaborate. The reasons, we can understand the Nevuah of Yehezkel, which both seem to say there will not be Avelut. I want to close with one point, and that is a comparison to the two, it's a short comparison, to the two places where we're told about a lack of avelut, and ironically, in both cases, we learn laws of avelut from that situation. So, what case am I talking about? Aharon, right? Both, and they are similar. They're similar. The person was not avel, dom Aharon, anik dom. Someone is taken from them, and we're told that that person that was taken from them is not to be mitabel them, and like I said, we learned the laws of avilut for that person. However, although those are similarities, I would say if we look a little bit closely, they're actually bipolar opposites, total opposing cases. Why do Aharon's children die? You don't have to tell me exactly why. Just they made a sin. They did something wrong. I don't care right now what they did wrong, but they did something wrong. Their death makes sense. It makes sense. It's logical. They did something wrong. You want to say it's a shame. Was it so severe? Whatever it is. They did an action. The action had a consequence. This was the consequence God chose. Therefore, in a divine theory, it makes sense. It's supposed to be that way. By Yehezkel, we're not given a reason why it should be. It should not be. It's senseless. The death is, I'm taking her. And the Torah doesn't, the Nabi doesn't tell us why. The second point that they're similar, and we'll see that they're really different, is the no avelut. Why is Aharon not to sit avel and his children? Meaning, that's the system. The idea is to preserve a certain structure and a system. You are not allowed to do this. You are Kohanim, you're Kohen Gadol, there's certain avodah that happens, there's certain avodah that doesn't happen, and in fact, we learn the halachot from that. Right? We learn the korbanot that could be eaten, what they do eat, what they don't eat, all the structured system of the Beit HaMikdash. The fact that they're not mitabel is to actually keep the system intact. Why is Yehezkel not mitabel? To obliterate the system. It's to indicate the absolute and total destruction of the system. What should be will not happen. The normative thing is you're supposed to be mitabel. The Beit HaMikdash will be destroyed and no one will be mitabel on it. As opposed to Aharon, where he's preserving the structure of the Mishkan. So it's a bipolar opposite. One is, it almost reminds you of the of one of the kinot we sing on Tisha B'Av, right? We say line, right? Besetim Mitzrayim, Besetim Yerushalayim, right? Everything is the opposite. Here is exactly what the avelut of Yehezkel, the lack of avelut Yehezkel, is the exact opposite of the lack of avelut of Aharon. Right? Aharon, two people died as they were supposed to. You find order, you find system. The system has to be preserved. Am Yisrael will continue. The Mishkan is continued. It happens on the glorious day of the dedication of the Mishkan, the day that our first Mishkan was built. Yehezkel's avelut is the day, or symbolizes the day, of the destruction of the Mikdash. It's obliteration. It's destruction. The system is gone. So it's the antithesis of that. It's it's a parallel, clear, but it's a negative parallel, right? One serves to obliterate the other. And of course, all this, as the Navi ends his words, in this idea, comes full circle, even though, right, because we're told, by the way, it's not just for the Beit Mikdash, it's for their children, B'nehem u'brotehem, and it's all, the Nevi says, this is all because of what? This is all because in Pasuk Kav Gimal, Unmaktem ba'avonotechem unhamtem ish elachem. This is all a result of your avon. Everything that happened is considered vadai a punishment. This is all punishment for your sins, and it comes again full circle. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen.